Chapter 1. Beginnings. Dear reader, in this chapter we explore the making of a peculiar man who found himself at the frayed end of a nation's unraveling rope of hopes and dreams. The same rope that has become no more than a representation of illusion and half-truths, pulled by the rich in their favor, while simultaneously tied around the necks of the poor and dull-minded alike. That is, of course, until they have worked themselves to the point of uselessness. Until the time of the much-anticipated release of this book, this man's actions have so far been obscured in a series of murky rumors, locked doors, and guarded letters. There is no doubt in the author's mind that this was the intentional work of the Avonians, in their ongoing effort to keep his name out of the minds of honest scholars and rebellious-minded citizens. It would not do to show those who control the common man that one person is capable of independent thought and could, given the right circumstances, upend whole kingdoms or ever-expanding empires. Yet we forget that it very likely took a similarly bold person to set about their very creation. The author believes that he may one day challenge the strength and tyranny of the Avonian officials and royalty, bringing the upper reaches of society to heel. With this in mind, let us begin the chapter a decade or so ago, at the time of when this book was written. The man referred to is Commander Cillian Volclaw Calhan, or simply referred to as Volclaw to friends and foes alike. It is the running that woke him in the night. The terror etched into the eyes of the women and children as they fled, watching fathers, uncles, and brothers fall before his steel and other worldly powers. Mixed with hardened determination, his skill and coordination remained unmatched. He had yet to come against a professionally trained or organized foe. As a result, the deaths were meaningless, just like the whole campaign set before him. Time away fighting a war often makes men reflect on life. That is what his father told him before he got himself disappeared. Volclaw left his home in the grand Avonian city of Penthia like an inexperienced, angry boy. Now he saw himself as a hard-end man, beaten, bruised and shaped by an unforgiving environment often hugged with the sharp rot of death and, perhaps more noticeably, without the earthly pleasures offered in abundance throughout the Avonian Empire. Now his home rested amongst strange sets of stars and beside men who speak in foreign tongues. He did gamble on returning, either as the man he once knew or at all. It did not help that the concept of home decayed long ago in his heart as his family dwindled to just himself and his brother. Instead, he clung tightly unto the hope of the men who came over with him and those who had proven their worth as they made their way through treacherous land. He knew most had families to go back to, while others were still young enough to enjoy the world. At the time, it had been over 2 years ago that Volclaw and his brother were commissioned to scour the western shores of the local tribes inhabiting the lands across a vast stretch of sea. These tribes had earned the wrath amongst the ruling class of Avonia, who were displeased by their constant harassment of the mining regions. As the mining regions themselves are a group of several islands that sit between Avonia proper and the lands of the tribals, they were often ripe for such attacks. Whether it was the constant overbearing encroachment of the Avonians on their lands or the empire's more discreet flirtation with slavery, much conjecture surrounds tribal attacks, or perhaps more accurately, tribal retaliation. Regardless, the resulting Avonian invasion was effortlessly touted as reclaiming previous ancestral land that had since been initially lost to plague and infighting and left to be consumed by savages. A convenient term, to be sure, permitting a whole nation to justify the pacification or, in simple terms, the murder of scores of people. However, he considered himself a soldier. not one of the opinionated scholars who often found themselves nose-deep in dusty old books, safe and conveniently removed from the rest of society within their coveted grand university found at the bottom levels of Penthia city. He quickly learned to keep dangerous opinions to oneself. Fundamentally, that is where his brother and him differed, and was the cause of many heated disagreements. Volclaw rightly feared that his more outspoken brother, Lochmere, would inadvertently lead his men down the dark path of mutiny against the fearsome Evonian kingdom. Tragically for Volclaw, Lochmere died during the campaign, approximately a month before the setting of the story that I will detail shortly. Evidence points that Lochmere died in skirmish fighting, with some others proposing that Volclaw silenced his brother for fear of himself and his men being collectively condemned for treason. A sniff of treachery from the royal courts of Evonia would be something that they could never come back from. In the end, Volclaw had no choice but to continue leading his meagre force of some 100 men by himself, all of whom could narrowly control, or in other words manipulate, an aspect of a somewhat defined range of otherworldly powers. A common term the reader might recognize and prefer for such people is manis. In capable hands, such a number had the power to conquer thousands. Although inexperienced, Volclaw was known, and as a result chosen by the Evonians, for being a uniquely skilled mani, paired with a sharp mind and a strong stomach for war. When Volclaw and his still-living brother first arrived unto the foreign shores, they were a small force of 65 mani men, most of whom were petty criminals from Penthia city that were given the option to serve in the military or wait it out in the deep, dark and damp pit that passes for a prison in that city. They were meant to be a small but efficient force that would breed turmoil amongst the local tribes until the larger Evonian force arrived. With little training on the men's part and experience leading such an effort on Volclaw's and his brother's part, it is estimated that half of the men were lost within the first 2 weeks. Worse yet, there was the risk of rival tribes banding together to get rid of the threat they posed. With little choice, over the months Volclaw bolstered his ranks by capturing, bribing, or converting magically gifted locals. It helped Volclaw that most magically gifted people over there were treated as either outcasts or petty gods that oftentimes led to sacrifice for experimental and fruitless rituals. Some of the more brutal tribes were known to hunt down manis as a way to prove their warrior spirit. Let us not forget for a moment that it was the Evonians who saw the potential of manis and what they could learn to do. With the first magical users coming about nearly 200 years ago, societies and the lands we inhabit have warped and changed as a result, in the case of Evonia, for the better. They are perhaps the best example of a society that successfully integrated, controlled, and harnessed their magical populations. It has been hypothesized on multiple occasions from many distinguished scholars that the Evonian kingdom has advanced more in the last 200 years than in the last 2,000. This was evaluated in reference to living standards, economy, culture, and military strength. Other societies have fared less well, with the Solarians initially setting themselves back with burnings of manis from the lower classes of society and the potential strength they imposed on the ruling class. Others, such as the divided freehold, have largely been coerced out of their magical populations by the Evonians. The now decade-old Treaty of Magical Integration is a contemporary example in which petty sums of gold and silver, and sometimes marriages with lower Evonian royalty, are used in exchange for the exceedingly economically advantageous manis. It is also no secret that magical people have been kidnapped from their very homes by other nations and even internal territories within the same nation. All of these practices, which the Avonians have led in many categories, are utterly abhorrent and denounced by the author in the strongest of words. It is therefore exceedingly clear that the Avonian kingdom wishes to have as many manes living within their society as possible. However, it is unclear that the eventual decision was made to send these highly regarded and rarefied manes, estimated at 100, to the Forsaken Lands. Some experts suppose it was politically motivated, to rid themselves of unruly and potentially dangerous manes that may misrepresent the larger group of peaceful, law-abiding, i.e. passive, manes within society. Others believe it was to simply probe at and gauge the strength of the foreign inhabitants before a full-scale invasion took place. To read further on this topic, the reader is humbly directed to the author's highly anticipated book, The Rise of an Evonian Empire, a Warning of Greed and Ambition. With digressions out of the way, we venture back to the state of our intrepid Volclaw. With his men, and the feeling of the loss of his only sibling, Volclaw stood before yet another destroyed village. The taste of rancid smoke filled the very air he breathed, and he wore fresh wounds that would likely scar. Like so many times before, he watched as the last of the remaining fighting men perished in magical fires, or through hails of sharp stone pellets that tore through muscle and bone. Eventually, his legs found themselves again, and he would have his grim walk amongst the mutilated bodies. Some were burned or blooded beyond recognition, while others had been perfectly petrified, with the telltale sign of foam spilling from their open mouths as the watery fluids within them had been weaponized against them. The hard sound of a horse's hooves striking the blood-soaked ground drew closer to him. One of his men was fast approaching him on horseback. Recent feelings began to creep up on him. His armor felt too heavy and hot. He hated this place, this foreign land, with a passion. He longed to return to Penthia and get his men back home, or at least to a place that would offer a life beyond war. That seemed like the only worthwhile purpose that he had to hold on to. The horrors he had faced and enacted, he knew they needed rest from it all. The type of rest that would heal the body, but not the mind. The more they continued, the more regret, shame, and other invasive wartime thoughts that would need soothing from continued use of alcohol and expensive elixirs later in their lives. Volclaw even hoped to take the locals he recruited, for he knew they had nowhere to go once their work was complete. They had indeed proven themselves, and most had picked up enough of the civilized language from the other men. He did not wish for the Avonians to use them as mere war fodder. In Volclaw's view, they had all earned respite. Since landing on this foreign land, they had achieved more within a single year than an army of 1,000 could have in 5. Nimbleness and concentrated strength encapsulated their tactical essence. The following are excerpts that likely took place, with embellishment based on a number of surrounding factors. Most of the following dialogue and events are derived from a careful collection of first-hand and second-hand accounts by the author. Our Volclaw, orders from Admiral Corun of the 2nd Evonian Fleet have been received. He requests that you ride out and meet him in person at once, at their camp in Blackened Cove, spoke Janmir, a bright young man and excellent topographer from Evonia. He had been sentenced for fraudulent activities against some of the richest families in Penthia. His background and natural cunning helped Volclaw understand the layout of the strange lands before him immensely. With Lockmere's demise, this was his second in command. His once clean, youthful face was now covered in ash and etched with concern. Volclaw made no attempt to hide that he would have preferred to remain there, amongst the dead, than speak with Admiral Corun. It was his first time meeting the man. Correspondence by letter left no warm impression towards the Admiral. By his rare dealings and now too frequent letters, the Admiral perpetually asked too much, yet gave too little to him or his men. He hoped that this signaled the end of the harrowing campaign. They had fulfilled their obligation to cripple the western coast and establish an Evonian enclave that would soon turn into a formidable invading force. Soon would be the time for Evonia to act. Before the major tribes came to their senses and focused their sizable war efforts on the increasing and far more advanced threat they posed to their collective lands. "Retrieve me Chill, Volnir and Lareo, and get them to meet me along the way," Folklore responded. "Sir, you were requested to come alone," replied Janmir, unease filling his voice. Folklore nodded towards Janmir, understanding what this meant. "In that case, follow through with what we discussed 2 nights prior. How many of the men remain loyal, Janmir?" Janmir took a moment to respond, seemingly taking on the weight of Folklore's words. Only a few seem to object, like Ermun and the Tihal brothers, and a few others have remained silent. Otherwise, the rest are loyal to you, our Folklore. In that case, tell them and any of the others you don't trust to stay here and finish up. We will deal with them later. Everyone else is to make their way through the forest and avoid open paths. They must not be seen. You will await my signal." Janmir looked worried, but Folklore had no doubt he would carry out his orders. Folklore motioned to leave, readying his horse. "What signal are we to look out for, our Folklore?" "If it happens, you and the rest of the men will see my call," replied Folklore, without the need to look back at his second-in-command. Folklore and his dark mare blended seamlessly into the night as he made his way to the Evonian encampment. As he rode, the moonlight revealed the outlines of strung-up bodies from nearby, conquered tribes. He passed by a particularly hulking dead warrior who had already been partially feasted upon by carnivorous wildlife. The now dead warrior had nearly bested Folklore, who now wore dented and marked armor due to the warrior's thunderous war club. What was originally meant to diminish the morale of the other tribes now served as a foreboding omen to Folklore as he rode by his past victories. After riding a while, Folklore eventually saw smoke and breathed in the fresh air of the sea nearby. He was close. Not long after, he saw the burning fires within the sprawling encampment from atop. He descended downhill until he reached the thick wall of tall logs, all sharpened at the top and preventing him from entering any further. A guard from a makeshift watchtower nearby called out to him. "What is your business here?" the guard shouted from above, peering down at the lone figure on horseback. The eyes of the guard could be faintly seen from where Folklore was sitting, an unnatural look of faint, luminous blue and grey. That was certainly owed to the enhancing effect of the elixirs that Evonian soldiers drank to best most of their foes. Continued consumption of elixirs, however, would eventually catch up to them, sometimes leading to weakened bodies or a slow death later in life. Folklore preferred to stay away from their allure of easy power. Not to mention that such elixirs have had at times varying effects on manes. One can often tell such elixirs by the sharp smell of fermented citrus, mere flavorings added to mask the other, more complex set of ingredients hidden within. "I was summoned by Admiral Corrin," Folklore called back in a curt tone. The wooden gate bulked and groaned at its own weight as it lifted upwards. Pulleys and chains could be heard until the gate reached a satisfactory height for Folklore to proceed. Once inside, Folklore made his way across the camp, taking careful note of the camp's numbers. He quickly surmised that there could be around 200 fighting men and war women, discounting non-combatants such as servant staff. This would only be the initial landing force, for their numbers would soon swell tenfold. A month ago, only Admiral Corrin and 40 other men resided here. Folklore and his men had awaited their arrival at the very spot he was currently treading upon. The soldiers in the camp looked strong and imposing, their luminous eyes piercing through the night. Admittedly, Evonian forged weapons and armor often boast the finest craftsmanship. It is known that Evonians spend 4 times as much per soldier than the Solarians, and some 9 times more than the typical freehold or TNA soldier. Scant attention is paid to Volclaw by the soldiers and other residents as he makes his way into the largest, most decorative tent situated at the camp's center. The Admiral's personnel guard let Volclaw through the exquisitely fashioned tent without a word, while the other men and servants live in more basic tents which house 4 sleeping rolls and not much else. Corran's tent was spared no expense. As Volclaw stepped in, he noticed that even the floor had a solid wooden foundation, with rich furs and skins delicately lining each step. Everything in the room was imported from Evonia, of course. The fragrance of dried summer spices and mulled wine filled the air. For a moment, Volclaw forgot where he was. A comforting feeling had suddenly struck him. He had felt as if he'd been thrusted back into Penthia city on a warm summer night. There he stood on the mid-levels of the commercial district, with busy restaurants serving exquisite-smelling foods to the wealthier portions of society. Note to the less-traveled reader, a restaurant is a sophisticated and contemporary concept of food enjoyment across Evonia. The soft touch of a woman's hand embraced his right arm as he looked on at the bustle of the lower levels below. There was a beauty to all of it. He looked back to see a familiar, heart-shaped face beaming at him. A pinch of warm, lazy wind momentarily swept her sun-blonde hair, hiding the grey of her eyes for only a moment. He snapped back from his daydream that invoked feelings of dangerous nostalgia and forgotten safety. Volclaw quickly realized that actual warmth had indeed caressed his skin. He had forgotten how cold the air was outside. He gazed over to the source of the warmth, where a welcoming coal fire crackled welcomely in a large pit at the center of the tent. It reminded Volclaw of a calm, pulsating heart. His eyes followed the smoke which escaped gracefully out of a small opening above. There he glimpsed a sliver of the shining stars watching him. In front of Volclaw sat a slender man, writing in a large leather-bound book. One could mistake him as a gracious man with his clean-shaven face, smooth pale skin, and long dark hair that looked to have the texture of silk. Beauty over brawn defined most of Evonia's elites, and the Admiral was no exception. The large book rested on an impressive ruby-wood desk. Streaks of vibrant red against wonderful shades of amber, reminiscent of coursing blood, that gave the rare and expensive Evonian wood its distinctive look. Volclaw noticed a metallic pitcher of wine resting on the table, easily within arm's length. A weapon, perhaps? No, that was too crude, even for him. Corran finally finished his writing and took momentary relief in his cup of wine, still not acknowledging Volclaw with what would likely be faux pleasantry. The Admiral wore fine linens and furs embroidered in gold, grey, and navy colouring, a typical Evonian palette. With the Admiral's face now in full view, it was also immediately noticeable that fine makeup covered every inch of it. This trend of makeup is indeed still very popular across all sexes and classes within Evonia. It is commonly rumoured that fathers and mothers from poorer classes have deprived their own children of food to afford such paints. The author notes that Evonian hubris and glut knows no bounds. Be wary, dear reader. Our Admiral Corran addressed Volclaw to the Admiral in a reasonably brisk tone. He took off his helmet to address the Admiral, affording the man a level of customary greeting suited to his standing. "Ah, Commander Volclaw, an expected pleasure," remarked Corran, leaving out the customary hour granted to Evonian courtiers. It did not matter that Volclaw was part of the Penthian court, for the Admiral was part of the Eramisa court, and thus was in much higher standing. The Admiral had now looked up from his cup and swiftly closed the heavy book with a loud thud. The Admiral slowly rose from his heavy ruby-wood chair, perfectly matching the lavish table. The Admiral bowed slightly and leisurely gestured towards two comfortable-looking red leather chairs by the fire pit. Folklore returned his bow and rested on the chair closest to the tent entrance. He laid down his helmet on a small table next to him. Folklore accepted a freshly poured cup of wine, although not out of courtesy, but from an eagerness to taste good wine. Simple pleasures such as this had been hard to come by in these lands, and even the author admits that Avonia does indeed produce some of the finest wines. The Admiral sat next to Folklore and drank from his cup. Folklore then followed, as it was rude to drink before your superiors. Suddenly, the taste of fine wine had reached Folklore's cracked lips. Gracious, the wine was indeed good, thought Folklore. So our Folklore, said Corin, who took the time to pause and lean forward with apparent eagerness. The Admiral's left hand now planted itself on his left leg, and he looked straight at Folklore with a smile that exuded an uneasy sense of satisfaction. Folklore could smell the wine off the Admiral's breath as he spoke nearer to him. Only 2 weeks prior, we still had several villages to take care of, all of which were at risk of banding together under some of the much larger inland factions. Out of sheer determination, you solved that little set of problems before it became a rather big one. Folklore took a few moments to respond, taking a sip of his wine while he thought about his next words. He laminated on his time away and the foul deeds he enacted upon the locals of these lands in the name of Avonia. Folklore slowly shook his head and let out a small laugh. You mentioned tribes and factions, Admiral. Some are independent, yes, that much is true, but most of these tribes are, or were, functioning townships. Others either belonged or had alliances with larger nations, with which we have avoided direct contact thus far. Those very nations pose a dire threat and would even challenge smaller nations like the Freehold back within our lands. You speak of them like they primitive beings living in mud-based dwellings like those in the farthest stretches of the Tierney swamplands. Yet most grow wheat and cattle, work stone, and even smith metal. They may not have yet matched our levels of sophistication. That much is true. The only tangible difference that I see lies not in the quality of their weaponry or the height of their walls, but in the shade of their skin and the languages from their tongues. They are people living lives that are somehow in Avonia's way. Folklore looked at the Admiral, who smiled pleasantly at Folklore, but ultimately looked disinterested. Yes, quite right. Your point, Folklore? Corin responded in a waiting tone. Of course, Admiral, said Folklore, smiling to himself. He decided to collect himself, as anger had crept up on him. Regardless, I upheld our end of the bargain, Admiral, as did my men. Folklore's last sentence served as a stark reminder to Admiral Corin. We are finishing up the last village as we speak. My men are burning the bodies and so forth. Some of the bodies of their warriors have been saved to be hung and serve as a message like we did with the other villages. Unpleasant business, as you know. Folklore pretended to act bored now at his own words, but such brutal yet effective tactics gnawed at him. His brother had a better stomach for it, he thought. However, he now had the burden of his men's lives in his hands. This would be an attempt to appeal to the Admiral's more noble nature, if he had one. Corin continued to smile at Folklore, yet the smile did not reach the Admiral's eyes. Familiar feelings overcame Folklore, fear and anger. It did not help that he truly disliked the man. The bared teeth of the Admiral as he drank reminded Folklore of the savage crocodiles in the Tierney swamplands, rows of sharp, jagged teeth set within upturned lips. Both had the resemblance of a smile, but neither contained any warmth. What would follow would be likened to the inevitable crunch of prey. For Admiral Corin, Folklore figured the inevitable crunch would be his own ill-fated news. That they did, our Folklore, Corin responded in a sympathetic tone that lacked sincerity. Volclaw noticed that the Admiral had begun to add "our." The Admiral threw both hands theatrically, almost spilling his wine. "Although there is still much work to be done, our Volclaw. A lot more. Yes, you and your men have scoured the western shores as commissioned by King Gorgu of Penthia city. However, there are also the wishes of High Queen Delvet Eleanor de Champ of Ivonia and her court, a court of which I sit in, and one that everyone across Ivonia is ultimately beholden to." The Admiral's tone was full of pride, which put Volclaw off his wine. He placed it on the small table next to his helmet. "A promise is a promise, Admiral Corun," reminded Volclaw, yet again to the Admiral, that he had indeed fulfilled his original duty. Hints of impatience and anger decorated his voice. Admiral Corun did not look over to Volclaw. Instead, he held his gaze towards the fire pit. He appeared enamored by the flames as they leapt and danced around in their red and orange hues. The Admiral smiled again and continued to sip his wine. Looking at the Admiral, Volclaw noticed the grey of his eyes fade into a misty golden colour, the telltale signs of copious elixir usage. Such rich colours gave away the Admiral's expensive tastes and his likely dependence on them. This was a man who only knew indulgence, thought Volclaw. Admiral Corrin finally continued. "The demonstrated effectiveness of using Manis as a concentrated forward force has indeed been noticed across our ever-expanding empire and amongst the other nations. You and your men are proof of the application of the enviable talents gifted upon your kind. You achieved what was considered an improbable success." The Admiral seemed quite pleased with himself, as if he had personally led Volclaw's men. There was no doubt the Admiral would be highly awarded by the Queen, despite resting comfortably in his tent while Volclaw and his men faced death each day. In some remote way, Volclaw assumed that the Admiral's words were supposed to resemble a compliment, yet he remained silent and unflattered. Corrin continued. "While all of the royal courts are exceedingly excited by this development, concern still remains. While such strength raises concerns amongst our enemies and how they too might utilize their magical populations, the common people across all of Ivonia are divided. Who can blame them? Each day they see nobility shower the magically talented with praise, education, fine gifts, and even finer places to stay, regardless of blood or upbringing. The recent treaty of magical integration with the Freehold has demonstrated that even non-citizens can rise quickly above them. Imagine that." The Admiral tutted and shook his head. Volclaw looked towards the Admiral with a questionable look, as he wondered if the smug man knew that his own mother was not an Evonian citizen. Such things were easily known amongst Evonian courts. "I even hear my own men ask, why do these people receive such rewards?" continued the Admiral. "Which they continue with just because some can shoot fire from their hands, or others can heal broken bone. I cannot say I blame them." The Admiral got up and poured himself another cup of wine. He offered Volclaw a refill, who wordlessly refused by reaching over and placed his hand firmly over his half-filled glass. The Admiral sat back down and rested his gaze on the fire pit again. "Of course, I truly do not care much for such concerns. What I am concerned with is advancing Ivonia into the empire it is meant to be. The rewards of such conquest will speak for itself in time, however. There are other pressing matters to discuss. My scouts arrived back this morning from their journey inland. They reported that some of the biggest tribes, or nations if you insist, are beginning to put aside their differences and will finally come together to address our little bit of handiwork on their neighbours." The Admiral said this with a more gratuitous tone. "Through you and your men, the Evonians are rightly regarded as an undeniable force that will coerce them into action." As the Admiral spoke, Volclaw looked at his helmet resting on the small table. Its hollow eyes stared back at him. The uneven metal surface of this once brilliant piece was starkly exposed against the brightness of the fire. How his time of warring had stained and disfigured it. A distant memory of pride entered as he remembered when King Gorgu himself presented to him before he set sail from the calm waters of Hascrest Lake that connected Penthia city all the way to the sea. How a sliver of metal had protected him from death on many occasions. Where pride was once felt, regret had now filled its place. His brother's death consumed his thoughts. If anything would be the source of Volklor's infamy, surely that would be it. His kin would be the catalyst for all the actions that would follow. A deep anger boiled within Volklor as he watched the Admiral's lips move up and down. Careless words flowed out of the Admiral. Volklor knew this pampered man paid little mind to the sacrifices he had endured in these forsaken lands. He had lost a brother, lost the patience of a lover, lost soldiers turned friends, and he now felt he was losing his mind. They would not take that at least, he thought. Volklor felt his left palm begin to bleed under the pressure of his clenched fist. "Now is our time to deliver a crushing blow to them," continued Admiral Corran. "We cannot wait for reinforcements to arrive in the next few weeks. I cannot leave it to chance. But why must we deal with chance when we can utilize you and your men to drive the advantage you have expertly gave us until now?" The Admiral looked at the enduring Volklor, this time more intensely and still smiling. "You and your men know the land. You have dealt with its people. You have weeded out the best warriors on this side of the coast, and now its soft innards are exposed, ready for us to strike a lethal blow before all the tribes can put aside any differences and truly unite. You have the momentum, power, and agility to strike at them while most of their best people are in one place to conduct their talks. They will be weak this way, even in their numbers, and will not expect a coordinated attack during this time. With each tribal leader you cut down, we gain a decided advantage once our reinforcements arrive and are ready to march. We have been at bloody war for nearly 2 years, Admiral," Volklor responded through gritted teeth and proceeded to stand upright. Volklor quickly found his tone had slipped. "My men are tired. I am tired. It could be a trap for all we know, and it is not what was agreed. My servitude ended with the last village we burned, and its warriors slaughtered." "You will sit down," roared Corran. His eyes burned with anger, and his crocodilian-like smile retreated behind his thin, wine-stained lips. Moving his resting helm aside, Volklor calmly took a seat on the small table and faced the Admiral directly. "No, Commander Volklor. Despite my accommodating nature, this is unfortunately not a discussion," Corran continued. His voice had quickly resumed to its calm, more measured state. "The royal courts were unanimous. Parliament ratified it. It is done." Putting his wine aside, the Admiral got up and pulled a piece of parchment from the closed leather-bound book. He handed it to Volklor without a hint of sorrow. Volklor, however, looked at it in dismay. Volklor read it quickly the first time. The second and third time around, he read it with increasing desperation as each unforgiving word remained stubbornly unchanged. Through gritted teeth, he read the words of those who had never physically fought in a war. Demands and calls of loyalty to him and his men filled the text. Thoughts raced across his mind. All of the killing they enacted, all of the suffering they endured, all of the pain that was caused. Deep within Volklor, he knew that this madness had gone on for far too long. He was a victim of his own success. He was too good at warring, yet they would have him carry out more? The answer was no. Ivonia and all its elites would not even afford him a modicum of rest from it all. For a brief moment, he found his situation almost humorous. The society that managed to take everything away from him dared to ask for his unending loyalty and servitude. Volklor slowly stood up and towered over the admiral, who now stood over the fire pit to warm his hands. "If I refuse, Admiral," he said, placing the parchment aside. The admiral let out a chuckle. They both knew the answer to his question. "Please, Volclaw, I would gladly sentence you to death without a second thought. The tongues and hands of your soldiers who refuse the order will be cut, and they would be left to rot in the wild." Admiral Corran took another drink. "Besides, you have tribals within your command. While they have done very well, I still would not like to think of the judgments that would handed down to them if their own commander was deemed a traitor. Perhaps they would be carted off to the mining regions. I think that would be a very fitting punishment, given that it was their people that caused so much trouble for us there. Just as I overlooked the little transgression of your recruiting of foreigners, I will do the same for your unflagrant tone with me. Normally, I would expect gratitude, but I doubt you know what that is, our Volclaw." Volclaw barely listened to the admiral. Instead, he focused on the rubywood desk, which housed something familiar. Pacing forward, he saw a half-played game of Conflict. This old and popular Evonian game had spread across to every nation on the mainland. Memories of his brother and him playing it under candlelight when they were young flooded through his mind. He remembered how they made the pieces himself, so they were too poor to afford the game. Crude, but playable. His father taught them the rules. This was all before Evonia's horde of collectors arrived in Tierney for them. It was childish to admit, but it was partly his inspiration to become a soldier. The game simplified and romanticized the concept of war, having multitudes of nameless fighting men and women to do your exact bidding. With the push of one tile, 100 or 1,000, whatever you imagined, would destroy or be destroyed by your opponent. He thought how players never give a second thought to all those imaginary lives lost. Attention was only ever placed on the frustration or elevation of each move. Strategy was all that mattered, both in the game of Conflict and the game he found himself in. He picked up a tile. The courtier, a tile which represented and housed the monarch. If it dies, the game is lost. A smile grew on Volclaw's lips. "Are you even listening, our Volclaw? I do not think you understand," the admiral said, before Volclaw unexpectedly interrupted. "No, it is you that fails to understand, Admiral Corran," Volclaw stated without hesitation. Courtesy and fear had left his voice. He inched closer and loomed over Admiral, more threateningly now. The admiral raised a single eyebrow and pretended not to be unsettled by Volclaw's aggressive behavior. "I knew that the greed of both you and the very institutions you represent would push too far, take too much. How you would easily trade our lives without a second thought. At least the respect from my soldiers, both living and dead, was hard-earned." Corran clasped his cup of wine and tried to speak to the hulking man before him. "You shall," he said, the only word he was able to say. "I too shall offer you the same courtesy you granted unto me, Admiral Corran. I will grant you no further thought for your treachery unto me," interrupted Volclaw again. Just as the admiral's lips touched the silver of his cup to take a drink, with a strong likelihood that he would call his guards to haul Volclaw away soon after, the fire pit swirled and rose angrily. The admiral wordlessly dropped his cup, wine spilling on the fine rugs and pelts around him, as the fire rose to a great height and expelled itself violently through the opening of the tent above. The fire, which now resembled the deep-seated anger that churned within Volclaw, engulfed the pitiful admiral in mere moments. Bursts of fire ripped through the tent and across the sky. Only a brief scream left the admiral's vocal cords before his scorched body dropped dead on the floor. Fire began to consume the tent. Volclaw swiftly picked up and donned his helmet again and placed the courtier tile that he was still holding into his pouch. It would serve as a fitting reminder of the night he stood against an empire and its numerous, swollen courts. Volclaw walked out into the open night sky, which rained various elements and arrows from the tree lines surrounding the Avonian encampment. The admiral's tent guard lay dead on the ground. Arrows had struck his exposed flesh, and stone pellets had ripped apart his chainmail. Screaming and shouting spread chaotically throughout the camp. The great wooden gate that Volclaw had entered the encampment from collapsed at the might of Volclaw's manny force, and fighting ensued. The camp was in a flurry of shouts as sleeping soldiers ran out half-dressed with swords in hand. Squires raced to quickly place armor on their knights, but they too would soon find themselves running away from the onslaught of projectiles coursing through the sky unto them. With the motion of his hands, Volclaw let the fire of the admiral's tent spread hungrily to the rest of the encampment around him. Volclaw paced forward with calm determination. War had been his domain, not theirs. Volclaw put any who stood in his way to the sword or the magics under his control. Volclaw's exceedingly rare gifts would be the last thing his enemies would remember. With powers borrowed from those loyal to him, he could theoretically harness anything. Even amongst manes, his gifts were exceedingly rare. The term for such manes are leeches. In contrast to the still rare but glorified providers, manes who enhance the abilities of other manes, leeches tend to be met with both fear and unfortunate ends. For more on this topic, the writer directs the reader to a fellow educated writer, Gilbert H. Porchet, and his book entitled A History on the 12 Identified Disciplines of New Magics. The fighting within the encampment continued throughout the night. By morning, the entire Evonian fighting force was annihilated, and the civilian stock had scattered. Volclaw and his battle-hardened men stood triumphant. Atop the burning embers of the Second Fleet, Volclaw put his mind towards the future. This courageous man knew that the best course of action would be to salvage any valuables within the now ruined encampment and use it to treat with the major tribes. Both his fearsome reputation and his gifts would surely grant him an audience. He would need that to ensure the survival of him and his men. The people of this land would benefit too should they be wise enough to accept this help. For then, Volclaw would have the strength to prevent Evonian expansion and, in the writer's deepest wishes, come to the shores of the mainland and challenge Evonia's dominion over the other nations. The civilized lands may yet be free, dear reader. Within the next few chapters, the writer will cover the 5 major tribes of the foreign regions that Volclaw had reported contact with. First, we will begin with the rather sophisticated Erasons, who likely trace their roots to Old Evonia. Second will be the highly aggressive Great Rains, who are said to choose their leader based on a deadly game similar to conflict. Third will cover the Great Rains' sworn enemy, the Enlivened, who reportedly utilize large amounts of mind-altering medicines on themselves and toxins against their foes. Fourth will be the Herders, the largest tribe or nation who pride themselves on owning great herds of livestock. Fifth and last, the enigmatic and feared Cloudwalkers who dwell in some of the coldest, most treacherous mountain terrain known to man. The writer will then proceed to provide expert judgment on
Ave, what on the good green earth do you think the time is? Says the gruff, tired voice of a man. I look up to a large shadow leaning on my doorframe. In the faint candlelight, I make out a familiar pair of striking grey eyes peering at me, ones which can instantaneously transform from fun to serious. An example of this unfolds in front of me. Sorry, Father, I say, no doubt looking very guilty, as I notice that my reading candle has melted most of the way, its hot wax pooling in the plate. I quickly peer outside and realize that it is the dead of the night. I quickly try to scramble for an excuse. Well, I could not sleep, as I was excited about the book Mother gifted me today. My father stands straight and paces forward. "Trying to put this on your mother, eh?" he says, placing a finger atop my book and pushing it forward to peer into it. His eyes visibly roll upwards for a moment, and he lets out a loud sigh as he spots the title. "Ah, your mother gave you that damn book when I expressly told her not to, Ivonia. Pieces of the Downfall, a book written by a cracked dissident." He sighs. "I swear, I may have taken your mother out of Tierney, but I often forget that you cannot take the Tierney out of her. Come now, I hope you do not believe all of that drivel. Evonian gold and silver has made the town and its inhabitants, including us, fairly prosperous." Well, the author makes some interesting statements. Are they true? I ask earnestly. Father shrugs, as he likely never bothered to read such books. He was a smart man who preferred reading poetry and new exploits. He stayed away from books detailing strange happenings, myths, pointless politicking, as he often put it, all of which took my fancy. I know he blames it on my youth. "Come now, I want that candle out as soon as I leave the room. Least you do not want to awake and see me off," he says, knowing that was the main reason I could not sleep. "Yes, father," I say in fake misery. I look to him and smile. He provides me a hug, and I smell the scent of beer. He likely indulged Grandpa on his last night, as he generally stayed away from alcohol. He soon straightens up and ruffles my hair playfully before seeing himself out. He looks back to me before leaving. Honoring that I avoided trouble, I lick my fingers and pinch the candle flame, letting morning come to me.